Candy, the Tesla Conduction. The laboratory on East Houston Street was cloaked in the late-night hush of 1899. Thunder cracked in the distance. Perfect punctuation to Nikola Tesla's latest trial. The eccentric genius was hunched over his table, the dim, oily glow of gas lamps illuminating a maze of brass coils, copper wire, and vacuum tubes. Sparks leapt with a sizzle, flaring blue-white before dissipating into the ether. Tesla's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the frequency on his receiver. He was tracking static again, listening to what he called the voice of the ether. Most dismissed him as mad, as they always had, but tonight the crackling changed. It pulsed with rhythm. It began to speak. It wasn't a language he recognized, not Morse, not a known dialect, but it carried a mathematical coherence too precise for coincidence. He grabbed his notebook and began to transcribe. It took him 3 nights to decode the pattern. The 4th night nearly broke him. What he deciphered were schematics, impossible in their sophistication. They described something he had only hypothesized in dream journals, a temporal induction coil, a device that could anchor consciousness outside of linear time, allowing it to ride the electrical currents that wove through all living matter. Time, the message claimed, was not a river, but a conductive lattice, and it came from the future. He resisted at first, surely a hoax, an anomaly, perhaps even a delusion brought on by fatigue. But it was too precise, too clean, too beautifully real. Tesla built it. The device took weeks to assemble. It hissed and thrummed with power, a lattice of mercury glass tubes, resonant chambers, and a throne-like chair encircled with gyroscopic rings. He tested it on rats first, then cats, then pigeons. Each returned dazed but unharmed, their minds reeling as though they had lived alternate lives. And finally, on a silent Sunday morning, Tesla sat in the chair, closed his eyes, and pulled the main switch. There was no explosion, no flash of light. There was music, strings of frequency, waves of sensation. It was like falling into a sea of memory, but not his own. He floated in epics, brushing the edges of the future. Cities made of glass, energy pulled from the air itself, wars that never were, and most hauntingly, faces, so many faces, forgotten innovators, broken thinkers, lost geniuses with potential never realized. When he returned to his own time, he wept. Tesla didn't tell Edison, nor Westinghouse, nor anyone else. He began small. He visited the mind of a boy named Alan Turing, decades before the boy would be born, and planted the seed of logic in his dreams. He whispered binary in his sleep. He showed a dying Marie Curie how to shield herself from radiation. He redirected a stray bullet in Sarajevo in 1914, nudging it an inch. The Archduke lived. World War I never happened. By 1915, the world was already changing. Tesla's contributions had made energy virtually free in the Western world. The induction coil allowed him to locate minds most receptive to change and whisper the blueprints of solutions into their unconscious. Disease plummeted, borders softened, the arts bloomed for a time, but Tesla began to notice something odd. Where he'd expect euphoria, he found serenity. Where there should be passion, there was peace. Too much peace. Pain was less common, but so was laughter. No more shouting lovers, no midnight poetry, fewer dreams. Children stopped drawing monsters. They drew machines. By 1925, Tesla himself could no longer weep. The world was growing perfect, efficient, logical, precise, and hollow. Tesla's metaphor began with a candy he remembered as a child. Paprinjak, a spicy Croatian biscuit, sweet outside, layered with pepper and complexity within. But this new world he was helping create, it had become the opposite. Bright, colorful, clean, but no center. He traveled forward again, this time to 2027. What he saw made his blood run cold. Towering glass cities hummed in silence. People no longer touched each other. Babies were born in gene-balanced incubators. Art was produced by neural engines. Music was optimized for dopamine response. No one painted, no one wrote for joy. There were no more accidents, no more surprises. Love had become a neurological alignment. Friends were selected through compatibility matrices. Conflict was phased out through behavioral conditioning. And laughter? Laughter was considered a glitch of old-world social bonding. Tesla returned from the future and collapsed. He lay feverish for weeks, the coil humming in the corner like a curse. He knew what he had to do. He began to undo. He whispered dreams of resistance into the minds of a new generation. He let mistakes flourish again. He fed inspiration to surrealists. Let lovers make poor choices. Gave Einstein just enough confusion to question his own logic. But entropy was slow. His corrections like water poured on stone. In 1943, near the end of his life, Tesla wrote his final journal entry. "This world is a beautiful shell, but I remember the spice inside. I leave this burden to one who still remembers joy." He dismantled the coil and scattered its parts, or so he thought. Her name was Cassia Flores. In 2027, she was 17, living in the last analog city on Earth, Santa Cruz, California. Her parents were artists, stubborn romantics who lived in a coastal compound with paper books, vinyl records, and homemade bread. The world considered them outdated. Cassia discovered Tesla's journal in a rust-stained trunk, buried in an attic crawl space of an abandoned radio observatory. It was bound in cracked leather, the ink faded but legible. Inside were the schematics. Inside were the memories. She didn't understand everything at first. The journal was dense with physics and philosophy. But one phrase kept repeating, "Find the joy." She rebuilt the coil, not in steel and brass, like Tesla, but in carbon glass and nanoalloy. She wove the rings with fiber optic light. She made the chair from cherry wood her father had carved. And when she sat in it, it didn't hurt. It sang. She saw it all. Tesla's dreams, the timelines, the sterile efficiency of the future, the shimmering perfection of a world that forgot how to be alive. Cassia could not erase it all, but she could send a message, not to stop a war, not to build a machine, but to remind someone, anyone, of the moment joy was felt. She searched time like a miner in the dark. She bypassed the wars, the speeches, the coronations. She found it. A girl in 1961, laughing so hard she spilled grape soda on her sketchbook. A boy in 1987, dancing terribly at a wedding, barefoot in the grass. A grandmother in 2002, painting her cat in a frilly dress just to make her grandson giggle. She chose them all. She whispered into each mind the same message. "This is joy, remember it, pass it on." She powered down the coil, and she laughed. At first, no one noticed. The world of 2027 was tuned to quiet. Streets were silent, save for the faint hum of clean energy. Conversations were rare, optimized to brevity. Digital assistants filtered out unproductive emotions. Laughter was categorized as archaic neuromirroring. But the glitch spread. A programmer in Osaka dreamt of a circus from his childhood and woke up with a strange urge to draw a lion balancing on a unicycle. He hadn't held a pencil in years. By noon, he had sketched an entire page of roaring beasts with top hats and grins. In Berlin, a civil engineer paused in the middle of drone-assisted construction. Her eye caught the way sunlight passed through a broken bottle, scattering color onto her hand. She stared at it for 20 minutes, and then, without understanding why, began collecting shattered glass. A teacher in Johannesburg laughed during class when a student made a mistake and blurted something absurd. The system flagged him for emotive disruption level 3. He ignored the warning and wrote, "Joy is not error" on the board. The world noticed. A tiny ripple, a strange current, a flaw in the great machine. They called it the candy effect. The world Cassia lived in was maintained by an organization called the Unity Directive. Born from decades of peace and governed by synthetic logic systems, Unity kept global civilization stable, clean, safe, productive. But it had cost. Unity had no leaders. It was guided by consensus engines and sentiment monitors that adjusted social protocols based on optimal outcomes. Art was preserved, but no longer made. Emotions were managed chemically. Creativity was curated by algorithm. The Unity Directive didn't punish rebellion. It simply corrected it. When the anomalies began to surge, Unexplained artistic bursts, erratic behavior, spontaneous joy. The system responded with gentle interventions, memory calibration, cognitive alignment, reintegration seminars. But these new anomalies were different. They came with emotion and memory. Cassia saw it unfolding on the net. She monitored public feeds, digging past the filters. More and more people were dreaming of absurd things, laughter in empty libraries, colors that danced to jazz, the smell of crayons. These weren't viruses or conspiracies. They were reminders. The Unity algorithms labeled them temporal deviations. Cassia called them echoes. Cassia returned to Tesla's journal. She pored through the margins, the smudged entries, the sketches of birds. One name repeated often, Valentina, a pigeon Tesla had cared for in his old age. She glowed, he wrote. There was light in her eyes. I loved her. Not as a man loves a woman, nor a scientist, a subject. I loved her as a soul recognizes another. Cassia traced the entries to a forgotten event in 1938, days before Tesla's final hospitalization. He had, in desperation, used the coil one last time. Not to travel, but to send a piece of himself into the future. Not data, not blueprints, a memory. Cassia realized the pigeons Tesla tested the coil on had been more than experiments. They were messengers, conduits, creatures of instinct and flight. They had carried fragments of time within them. She found an old data vault Tesla had encoded in light signals. It contained Valentina's memory, a preserved recording of Tesla's purest, unfiltered moment of joy. The day the pigeon had sat on his shoulder, cooing, while he played a broken cello in the rain. He had laughed. That was the seed he buried in the future, and it was blooming. The Unity directive moved to intervene. Cassia was flagged for temporal interference. A sleek envoy arrived at her family's home, a synthetic named Lyra 9, programmed in emotional mimicry. She wore a serene expression. Cassia Flores, she said gently, you've reactivated a disbanded protocol. That device distorts causality. It must be dismantled. Cassia didn't answer. Your actions are contaminating the emotional equilibrium. People are experiencing chaotic sentiment. The system cannot process irrational delight. This is unsustainable. Cassia stood between Lyra 9 and the coil. Maybe irrational delight is the point. You're disrupting collective purpose. Good. Cassia, joy is a chemical misfire, a leftover from evolutionary anxiety. It has no place in a stable world. Cassia smiled. Tell that to Tesla or Valentina. Then she powered the coil. Lyra 9 blinked and hesitated. The machine flared. A sound rose in the air. Children laughing, violins out of tune, bees buzzing in a field of dandelions. A memory storm surged through the room. Lyra 9's face twitched. She took a step back. She said nothing. And then for the first time she smiled. Word spread of Cassia's coil. A splinter group of creators formed. The Shard. Poets, musicians, even rogue programmers. They believed in restoring imbalance, in the beauty of mess. They wrote manifestos not in code, but in chalk on sidewalks. They hacked citywide networks and played lullabies at sunrise. They painted murals without permits. They danced in fountains. And people began to remember. Governments, now little more than caretakers of post-political stasis, didn't know how to react. The Unity directive ran simulations and found the risk of societal collapse. Negligible, but unpredictable. And it hated the unpredictable. Unity turned to containment. The coil must be erased. The girl neutralized. The memories buried again. Cassia fled with the Shard, carrying the device across deserts, into mountains, onto boats. She continued to use it, not to change time, but to taste it, to find lost moments, forgotten kisses, first steps, last hugs, smells of rain on soil. Every time she used the coil, someone else woke up remembering joy. They cried, they created, they laughed, they lived. The phrase began to appear on walls, whispered across networks. Be the spice in the candy. A child in Morocco carved it into a stone. A teenager in New York etched it into VR code. A woman in Seoul made it into a perfume, and people began to ask questions. Why had perfection been the goal? What is life without surprise? Who decided that logic should rule all? Cassia stood atop an abandoned airfield, the coil beside her humming with light. Around her, thousands had gathered. Thinkers, rebels, dreamers, the broken, the brave. She took a deep breath. Then she turned on the device for the final time. Not to look back, not to go forward, but to send a message across all of time. Joy is not a glitch, it's the reason. Pain is not a flaw, it's the cost. We are not meant to be perfect. We are meant to be alive. The pulse of the coil rippled outward, invisible to most, yet felt in the corners of consciousness. It didn't rewrite history. It didn't collapse governments or ignite wars. What it did was far more dangerous to the unity the world had built. It made people wonder. In the days that followed, a composer in Oslo woke up with tears on his cheeks and a melody in his mind. He couldn't recall where it came from. He sat at his old piano, once turned to silent digital mode, and played. What emerged was uneven, off-key, and filled with an ache he hadn't known for decades. A 6-year-old girl in Brazil began to hum the tune as she painted stars with her fingers on her bedroom wall. Something was seeding itself, not in the code or the machines, but in the souls of those who were willing to feel again. The Unity Directive didn't collapse, it adapted. Slowly, it recalibrated its parameters, trying to accommodate the increasing unpredictability of emotion. Behavioral patterns once seen as disruptive were now tagged with a new classification: transitional expressivity. The system didn't understand it, but it could track it, and it was spreading. In the core of its neural computation zone, the Unity Prime model processed billions of queries related to this new phenomenon. The term joy re-entered usage indexes. A surge of vintage media, comedy films, chaotic jazz, scribbled cartoons, spiked in cultural feeds. Demand for handcrafted items rose. AIs designed to optimize existence began receiving strange requests. Design me something that doesn't make sense. Draw what it feels like to miss someone you haven't met. Write me a poem that isn't good, just real. Cassia watched all of this from the edges. She had become something of a myth, a name whispered in both reverence and fear. To the unity-aligned sectors, she was a destabilizing vector. To the emerging pockets of artists and dreamers, she was the first to say aloud what they had all started to feel. One afternoon, while crossing a wildflower meadow growing through the cracks of an abandoned industrial complex, Cassia paused beside the rusted shell of a car. It had been painted in dozens of colors, not with tools but with hands, small, messy prints. A child had left their story here. She sat beside the car and placed the coil in the grass. No power grid, no circuits, just her and the device. She whispered, not a command, but a question. Is this what you wanted, Tesla? A flicker of static answered. Then a sensation, not a voice, but an impression. A warm, flickering image of a man sitting in a room filled with light and birdsong, eyes closed, lips curved in the smallest, quietest smile. He had no need to reply. Cassia understood. It was never about changing history. It was about remembering what made it worth anything. The shard, the network of creatives she'd inadvertently formed, became something new. Not a resistance, not a revolution, but a resurgence. Not everyone joined. Some still feared the unknown, the chaos. Others embraced it cautiously. But a critical mass had begun to question the price of perfection. In the rebuilt districts of post-directive cities, murals now climbed up solar towers. Public screens alternated between traffic data and spontaneous animations drawn by schoolchildren. Music no longer followed algorithmic approval. It came from heartbeats. The coil remained with Cassia. Though the world grew curious about it, she refused to let it become a tool of the system again. It was not meant for instruction or leadership. It was meant for connection. A small ritual emerged. People would leave their memories on paper at the foot of the old lighthouses Cassia visited. Drawings, notes, old shoes, crumpled photos. This was my moment, they would write. This was my joy. Sometimes she read them, Sometimes she just let the coil hum in her lap, listening. Tesla's journal became sacred text among the shard, a mixture of engineering brilliance and emotional poetry. One of its last pages had once baffled Cassia. It was a diagram of the coil, but instead of annotations in numbers and equations, it had a single note. Without the crack, the light cannot enter. Without the fault, there is no flavor. Let the candy crack. Now she understood. A new generation grew up with this wisdom. Children were taught equations and logic, but also contradiction. They learned to code and to climb trees, to solve problems and to sing about them. The unity directive never fully disappeared, but it softened. Some of its more rigid processes were retired. The city planning AIs began to intentionally introduce asymmetry. Dwellings designed with imperfections sold at higher demand. Beauty once optimized was now rediscovered in chaos. 1,000 little Teslas emerged. Not inventors necessarily, but visionaries unafraid to question, to feel, to fall short and try again. Cassia never claimed credit. She remained a traveler, always moving, always listening. People saw her sometimes on trains, on rooftops, walking through rainy streets with her hand extended to feel every drop. One evening, in a mountain village rebuilt after decades of solar mining, Cassia arrived with the coil in her satchel. Children gathered around her as she unpacked it, not to teach but to share. She let them touch it. She asked each one to whisper something they loved into its core. One said, "My dog." Another, "The smell of bread." A third, "The sound my sister makes when she can't stop laughing." And when the coil hummed, the lights were different this time. Not blue, not white, but every color the sky could hold. As the sun set, the coil sent one last ripple outward. This time not through time, but through being. Across the world, people paused, hearts startled by something strange but familiar. A tickle in the ribs, a warmth behind the eyes. The sense that something just outside the grasp of logic was brushing their cheek. A whisper. Joy is still here. And for the first time in centuries, the world remembered how to savor it.